Cool. So, welcome, guys. This is the second event that we've hosted so far. Just a bit more context about what Skulk mentioned is we started a non-profit organization called FedSA, Front End Development South Africa, and basically the goal is to just grow the front end development community in South Africa. So for those of you who are here on the at the previous event that we held, the Web Workers Talk, we mentioned that we renamed the CT Feds meetup group to FedSA, just to align the meetup group with the goals. So I guess, yeah, so we had the Web Workers Talk, and we're currently doing the Frost Q&A, and then probably next week we'll be doing a talk on Preact, which Mr. Skulk will be giving. So I guess Skulk, you can take it off.
Cool, yeah. So I thought instead of me kind of introducing Brad and maybe doing him a disservice, because he has loads of projects going on and like his name keeps on popping up everywhere. Um, so I would rather let him do the honor of kind of deciding how he wants to present himself. So I think like you can take it from there.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I appreciate just sort of deferring the intro, although I really love, usually I don't have a preferred introduction. I usually like hearing how everyone else perceives me. I'm always like, oh, that's interesting. I learned something new sometimes. But yeah, I'm Brad Frost. I'm a web developer and consultant based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the United States. Best way of putting it is New York City, and then there's Chicago. And if you were to drive from New York City to Chicago, Pittsburgh is right in between. Exactly. So if you ever do that, feel free to stop by, and I will buy you a drink. So, but yeah, I am for the last number of years, I've been working on a load of things around what we now call design systems, and I've created a methodology called atomic design, and wrote a book on that. But a lot of my work is around is as a front end developer, still sort of in the weeds and sort of working with like increasingly just sort of massive organizations that sort of have tons of different software in play. And increasingly it's, okay, well, how do we create a sane design system that can allow us to sort of, sort of have a consistent sort of brand and sort of front end architecture and stuff across their sort of enterprise or their organization. That obviously gets challenging whenever you have a bunch of different sort of technology stacks in play and all of this stuff. And the last few projects I've been working on have been ones where it's, okay, let's create a design system that's actually going to power hundreds of different brands on top of that. So this sort of like aesthetic sort of themes around the same sort of core architecture of the design system. So anyway, so yeah, so that's my trade is as a front end developer, but then like do a lot of stuff with respect to process and cultural change and getting designers and developers to talk to each other, getting developers able to better self-define themselves, just because the term developer is almost useless now, especially the term sort of front-end developer is like, well, what does that actually mean anymore? It can mean anything. So anyway, so yeah, those are sort of some of my like interest areas. Is sort of like I hang out on the what I call like the front of the front end, which is the sort of UI layer, like HTML, CSS, presentational JavaScript, and like there's the whole back of the front end, which is now pretty much all of the rest of web development. But you just happen to be doing all of that in JavaScript these days. So anyway, so yeah, I'm happy to talk about anything that's on your mind, design system related, atomic design, front end development, CSS, whatever.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Brad. So I myself have loads of questions, but I think I would rather maybe start, see if anyone else has questions. Maybe they want to ask it in the text chat, or maybe just if you want to unmute yourself, yeah, go ahead. Otherwise, I have loads of questions that were sent in prior to this as well.
I've got one to start us off. Can you hear me? Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
yeah,
Hey. Yeah, so design systems, the use of and the benefits of design systems sounds amazing. And I mean, Skulk introduced the concept to me a while ago, and the biggest obstacle that I found is actually getting business on board to spend a little bit more time. Like whenever we do estimates for tasks and we put out the UX and design time, like the amount of days or hours or whatever, and whenever we send off a quote and a request to reduce the amount of time comes in, you know, testing and, well, the design system work is usually the first that goes, and like cool stuff like automated testing also kind of like falls out. So what would be a good approach to kind of get business on board with something like this?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and is probably something that we've all sort of come up against. And it's one of the issues is that sort of design systems tend to get thought of as this sort of nice to have, or this like sort of cost center, this sort of like additional, like if we just like had a little bit more time, we could like properly like document everything and like make things more like flexible and stuff like that. And they're like, yeah, well, too bad. Like we have this thing that needs to go out the door, right? So there's a number of things. There's a number of sort of tricks to this. One is you just sort of create things as a matter of fact. You know, if your client is ordering you a car, you need the wheels of that car. If you need the engine, you need the doors, you need the power windows, you need all of the component pieces of that car. And so the client doesn't give a shit about that and how you organize that and think about that stuff, right? They want the car that comes off the assembly line. So a lot of the sort of design system work is really just a matter of how you and your team decide to operate. And in order to create the whole car, the whole software project or whatever, you have to make the parts of the whole. There's no getting around that, right? With design system work, it's just paying the parts of the whole a little bit more mind. And it's more of a mental consideration than it is this is actually like adding to our roadmap or adding to our timeline and our budget. And in fact, what you'll find is that it should actually accelerate the timelines. And just to even just use like a really crude and like simple example, like even for like a really small project, like my wife runs a jewelry company, and I built her website, and just by way of doing it, even though it's like a 4-pager, 5-pager website, by building components, by the time I got to the 3rd and 4th and 5th templates, I already had all of the stuff that I needed to build those templates. So it's like template 1 and template 2, you know, template 1 takes 100% effort because you're obviously having to build everything from scratch or whatever. Template 2 is maybe like 80% effort. Template 3 is 60%, template 4, 20%, template 5 is just like a matter of assembly. So again, it's like, it's more of a like behind the scenes thing, and it's a decision, at least initially. And like I'll try to get to this in a second, but like at least initially, it's just you doing your job and doing your job right. And so long as the working team is on the same page and you're like designing in components, whether that's if designers are working in Sketch and you're like, okay, we have a Sketch library and we're doing components and, you know, actually sort of nesting our symbols inside of one another and sort of building these for reuse and stuff like that.
Right.
Again, the actual like mechanical, like the actual sort of like time it takes to produce that stuff is sort of negligible, whether you do that or not. But like with if a designer is creating and drawing the same freaking rectangle for every single button that's going on the page, it's going to take them a lot longer versus if they actually sort of like bundle it all up as a symbol. Same goes in the front end world, right? It's like, okay, well, we're going to use this a bunch of places.
Cool.
So yeah, no, but here's the thing. It's like you can get away with that initially. And you know, and we see that happen all the time. It's just like, oh, well, here's our storybook, or like, here's our, like, whatever, like, we created the style guide, like just as a matter of, again, sort of doing the work. The trick is, though, like long term, that isn't sustainable. That's good as, like, we'll say, like a proof of concept. It's good to sort of like get the conversation started, like when the project launches on time and on budget and all of that, and the client's super happy, it's at that time you go, come over here, like look behind the curtain, like here's how we got this done this fast. And in fact, if you pay us more for like a phase 2 or whatever, what we could do is sort of formalize that work a little bit more, and you're going to get more sort of velocity, more acceleration, or higher quality products, or whatever the business is after. And that's probably the last piece of advice I'll say, is like, find the motivations of the business. Like, what do they care about? If it's about speed, you pitch it. You pitch it through the lens of speed. If they care about not getting sued for accessibility, which has been my work, I feel like, for the last like 3 years now, is a lot of really nervous organizations not wanting to get sued for accessibility issues, you pitch it through that lens. So it's like, find the thing that tugs on their heartstrings and find the way to sort of pitch the design system through that. It's like, by doing this, you get this, you get the thing.
Okay. So yeah, it's more a case of, if I can create an example, and so this is not necessarily like for the client. This also happens like in my team, because we are an agency that like focuses on DevOps and like data science, and I'm on the front end team. And I mean, there's a front end component to it most of the time, but the focus is always like, you know, getting the hard like data bits done. So I think I'll probably just end up creating an example, like a proof of concept, and then like showing them. Right? As possible. Yeah, I was thinking of that. Thanks for confirming.
yeah. And that's, you know, it's, I tend to find that colleagues, if colleagues are skeptical or like not on board, it is just really a matter of, it's like, you just need to do like a little bit of legwork. Like they say, it's like a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings and stuff. And that's just 100% true. It's just like, look, I already scaffolded this whole thing out. It's like, here's the homepage, but then also here's all the bits and pieces of that homepage blown apart and like sort of organized in a little bit of a way, which is helpful. And then they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Carry on, kind of thing, right? So that's it.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool.
Who else?
Go for it.
Hey, how's it? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, Jonathan.
What? Awesome. Thanks for your time. I just wanted to maybe hear your thoughts on advice in kind of using design to try and minimize scope creep. The background just for wanting those thoughts is I actually worked for a company that was burning through dev hours in a big way, because you'd go out with a front end design that would go into UAT, and then the client would keep making changes to that they'd have to go back, and eventually what you end up sitting with at the end of the day is awkward conversations to go, but you know, the monthly retainer is kind of, we've hit ceiling, so what now? And so the directorate at that stage started to think, all right, so we're going to drive all of this through signed off wireframes. And I'm just curious to hear, what have you seen in practice, and what are your thoughts on, bringing design on board, or to minimalize this kind of a scenario where you run out of budget?
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much room in a bucket, right? A bucket of time or whatever. And so I'm trying to think of like how we have tended to approach those kind of conversations is to just, for one, we've had like, I've had the privilege of working with really talented producers and sort of project managers over the last few years, which is a night and day difference for the first large part of my career, which is basically the client comes in and like they say jump, and the agency, or like what you on the receiving end, just say how high. And I think that like there are a number of sort of things to do to sort of help quash that. Is like, one is just sort of picking at things a little bit more, asking why, like a toddler, I think is really helpful to really sort of get at the underlying motivation. I think very often people react to surface level stuff, aesthetical stuff, or like, we need this and we need this and we need this. And a lot of times they're just sort of commenting at this very sort of, we'll say like cosmetic, or like, it's like, we need this. But so often you just sort of have to pick at that to go, oh, what you're actually saying is, we're scared of this. And then that we can address that tactically a different way that maybe doesn't, that works with the existing scope or whatever. But it's like, just be really cautious about taking their feedback or demands at face value. I think that's like one of like the big thing, and that's just like good client relations and stuff. It's just like, oh, tell me more about that. Like, I like, it sounds like this, or like reading between the lines, like we'll say sort of stuff like that, just to sort of like tee it all up and stuff. And again, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, is like talking about their motivations. It's like, what is motivating you to say this? And very often it's like, oh, okay, it's my boss's boss. We just got out of a meeting and they said just like stop the presses and do all of that. So that's really important to understand the why, like where their requests are coming from and where these sort of scope increases are coming from. The other thing is to just like play, it's like, have a solid plan of attack where it's like, here's the work that we're all agreeing to contractually, like here's what our roadmap looks like and here's what that work entails. So just like having like a good sort of explicitly outlined SOW is really good, because if you're just like, sure, we'll make you a website, well, there's 5-page websites and there's like 500,000 page websites, and and what goes on those websites could just be a hero and some cards, or it could be like the most sophisticated data visualization that's ever done. So it's like, it's just really, really important to sort of like be explicit with your scope, so that whenever they come in our contracts, we have like a change process thing that's basically like, we will address that if it's deemed necessary to do that. Here's how we append this document, this scope of work to accommodate that. But then a lot of times there ends up being some like horse trading that happens, where it's like, okay, that actually sounds like a better use of time, and as a result, this stuff is going to drop off. The last thing I'll say with respect to design sort of specifically is one thing that design systems are really sort of helpful as facilitating is conversations around like, I like purple, I want purple buttons, and please make me some purple buttons. And then you're able to just sort of say like, historically pre-design systems era, it's just like, I mean, I guess, and you're sort of like arguing at a very sort of subjective level with people that are like, I don't understand like why you're not skilled enough to make me a purple button. So with design systems, it's like, look, here's this whole like sort of philosophy. Here's our design language. Here's like, you know, you come to it with teeth in a design system, I think, like, and all of the, you know, the principles and the guidelines and the rationales and stuff are like not just grounded in like a subjective opinion, but are really sort of grounded, hopefully, in good research and good product design and industry best practices. So you're able to come to those fights, you know, armed with
armed, yeah.
Armed. Again, forgive my Americanism there.
No worries, thanks. I appreciate the input.
Yeah, it's challenging though, but it's all people stuff, man. It's like it really, I would say, like, just it's so much of this is psychology, and it's like, what are you motivated, like this is a thing in general, again, so bringing it back to the last question too. It's like, what gets the person you're talking to a raise and what gets them fired, and how do you sort of like lean into that? And that obviously changes if you're talking to an engineering manager, to a C-level person, to a design manager, to a, you know, junior designer or whatever. How you talk and sort of like work with those people, like you should just be like having those questions in the back of your mind, and that should sort of like frame how you're approaching the conversation. And that it's more like empathetic. It's not, I'm almost like pitching it as like manipulative. It's not, it's more like trying to better understand where they're coming from and like what's prompting them to say the things they're saying or ask the things that they're asking.
Cool. Xandro, I think you have a question, and I think maybe after that, Justin, can you maybe then pop us a couple that was submitted beforehand?
Sure, will do.
Cool.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So have you ever seen the website system-ui.com?
-ui.com.
Yeah, System UI. It's a group of open source developers that have gotten together and created kind of a spec for themes. The idea being that if libraries stick to this spec, you could easily drop a theme object in there and kind of customize the whatever design system they've built using those variables. So colors, fonts, spacing, etc.
System-UI.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when I saw that, I had an idea. I was like, this is like kind of cool, but all that it allows you to do is kind of theme the handful of libraries that support this theme spec, right? So like Rebase is one of those. Theme UI is the one they made as kind of like a reference implementation. And I thought that was quite cool. One of the things that annoys me about design systems and component libraries that you find online is they're unintentionally, they're kind of walled gardens, and they have their own ecosystems. Because if you use a component library and it doesn't have like an advanced date picker, like that allows you to easily pick ranges of dates, then you need to like build one, because you can look online on the web and you'll find one, but the chances that you're able to kind of massage the look of that range date picker into something that seamlessly fits with what you already have, those chances are fairly low. And even then, it's a lot of effort. So I was wondering if it'd be, I don't know, like, what are your thoughts around the idea of having a similar kind of spec, not necessarily just for theme variables, but for the actual API of components? And I'm not talking, it's not technology specific, so not React or Angular or whatever, but kind of saying, cool, a button will always be called a button, and maybe there's a variant, right? Maybe there's a color, and maybe there should be some kind of like base level of that the whole world could agree on. And then if you need a date range picker, you just grab one, maybe it's React implementation if you're using React, and you feed it your base components, and it doesn't need to know about your particular implementation of that. Like, I think that would commoditize a lot of this stuff, create a lot of interop, and just kind of get this boring rework out of the way,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's
yeah.
Especially from an accessibility perspective, this could be like really great, because
Yeah.
those base components, if they're built well, then okay, you're never going to have to not think about it at all. But maybe in a lot of cases, you kind of get a lot of it out of the box.
Yep. I got to say, I agree with you, and it is. I do find it, you know, especially having done this so many times, lather, rinse, repeat, a lot of things. It's like, yeah, the same conventions, the same API, the same like naming things. It's like once you sort of like land on those, it's like they're tried and true. And I think a button is a great example. So a button, all of us, every single one of us on this call, we've created a button, and it does a couple things. It could either be a button or a link that looks like a button. So, okay, so it's a button or an A tag. It can have an icon before it, like a search magnification icon. You can have an icon after it, like a right-facing chevron icon. There's different stylistic variants of a button. So it might be like a primary button with like the big like brand, you know, white text and like bright purple background or whatever. It could be like a secondary button. It could be like a hollow button or ghost button, however the hell you want to call those things, right? But it's the stylistic variants of a component. There's a bare variant that we often spin up, which is for something like a modal X button, right? It's just like, okay, it's like, doesn't have like any sort of its own styles. It's just sort of like surfacing this clickable icon essentially. It could be a large button. It could be a small button. It can occupy the full width of its container or not. So it's like, there's your button API. And like, that's every single design system I've worked on. You got a size attribute, or you got a size sort of API. You've got a variant API. You've got a full width sort of true or false kind of thing. And yeah, it's like, that's pretty much every website. And it's like, there's not much, unless you're making like just totally like, custom, like, I don't know, some like crazy, like SVG kind of, illustration that's also like clickable or something like that. But yeah, so I agree with you. I think that there's a lot of opportunity for these sort of like lower level components. And I'll also say that there's been like a lot of initiatives at the sort of platform level, like the like web W3C level, just like, let's freaking get tabs. Can we please have just a tabs component? Like, why in the world is this being put on our shoulders? Like, especially with respect to accessibility and stuff. It's like, these are patterns, accordions and tabs and things like that. And it's like, they could say like, oh yeah, we've like, we've given you like these recipes. It's like, no, in 2020, they're still just destroyed and annihilated and not perfect. It's like, this should be handled at a lower level. So I do agree with you that there is, I think, a lot of opportunity. And even if it's not like part of like the HTML spec necessarily, to have like this sort of layer on top of it, that's like an idea that I had like ages ago was like to create a almost sort of like a marketplace where it's like, oh, here's like Chris Coyer's tabs, and that has like 500 5-star reviews on this. And to actually sort of like try to like sort of create like almost like a home base for like these custom components, so that you can actually just sort of like grab them in and go. But obviously naming conventions differ, and like all sorts of stuff differ. And as we all know, naming things is hard, and people disagree on things. Developers are an opinionated bunch. So it's like that's probably the biggest risk there, is that it's just like, you don't have agreement. You have a bunch of pedantic developers that basically eat themselves and sort of spin themselves in circles, right? It's like we haven't been able to agree on pretty basic things. So it's like the spirit of it is great, but it's like, there's probably a reason why it doesn't exist. And that's because everybody thinks that they have the right way to architect it. And that's why we have 700,000 of them. But bringing this back though, like, one thing that you are correct in your assessment, that like a lot of design systems are walled gardens, and that's by design. when we work with companies, it's how I actually even define a design system is like, it is the official story of how your organization designs and builds digital products. And there's a bunch of ingredients to that story, but the idea is sort of, again, like leaning into people's motivations, and not just people's, but the organization's motivations, is going to actually dictate like how you go about architecting and building a design system and like what you include there. So it's like, I just finished up work not that long ago with United Airlines, is a big major airline in the US, but they travel worldwide, sure. And you know, they have 10 different product pods: homepage pod, manage your, you know, book a flight product team, manage your flight team, account team, like, right? And pretty much all of those pods display flight information, and they display them in 10 different ways, right? They design that. So the tough nut to crack with that design system, the thing that just immediately proved its value, was having a singular flight block component that we're like, here's how we're going to display flight information. And that's going to sort of be the same or the same shape. And like, you know, you could emphasize certain things or omit certain things and add this stuff if you're in like this flow or whatever. But the basic shape and architecture of that component was far and away the big thing. And now the flight block component is not a component that you would find in a material UI, or, you know, it's not like a lower level thing. It is a company specific thing that, you know, that was the sort of centerpiece of it. But I think bringing it back to what you were asking, it's like, there's a lot of like lower level stuff that absolutely can and probably should be shared. It's like, let's just freaking solve this as a group together, get it right, set it and forget it, and move on with our lives.
Cool, thank you.
Yep.
Justin, do you maybe want to pop some of the questions that were sent beforehand? Maybe let's do 3 of them.
Okay, sure. Hi, Brad. Thanks again for taking the time to chat with us.
Yeah, thanks.
So we sent out a Google form for people to put in some questions that they had wanted to ask you beforehand. So I'll take you through a couple of those. You may have answered some of them in some ways already. So
okay, I'll try to not be as long-winded either. So
sorry.
I'll try not to be as long-winded, so we can do like a bit of like a rapid fire kind of thing.
Okay. So one is around. Well, there are 2 questions that are fairly similar, and that's around, you know, people who are junior or just starting out in this kind of field, and what kind of advice you have around that. So one person asked, as a developer with 3 years experience and hearing seniors talk about front-end related frameworks, systems, processes, etc., sometimes this seems overwhelming and daunting. Yeah. I think it's overwhelming and daunting for those of us who've been doing it for ages as well.
Yeah.
And there seems to be so much to learn. Where should I even start?
Yeah.
And then something that's kind of tangentially related to that is someone asking, they're new to CSS and to design in general. And one of the big things that we are grappling with at the moment is around layout tools that we now have in the browser finally. And where do you think the future of that might be going? So Grid, Flexbox, etc. So if you could perhaps give some advice on people just getting going, and then where do you see us moving in the future with these new layout tools that we have?
Yeah, no, those are really good questions. With respect to sort of like junior level stuff, it's like you gotta like start somewhere, and we're all overwhelmed. And we'll also say the game has changed significantly from whenever I joined, and I'm sure that a lot of other people sort of joined. It's like once upon a time, you know, like there's only so much you can do, and now it's like there's just this explosion. The whole landscape, the whole universe, you know, GitHub, just number of GitHub repos and numbers of different sort of specialties and job titles that didn't exist before, is the concept of like DevOps and like all of that stuff. It's like it has grown so big that no one of us has our hands around the whole thing. So like, just give yourself permission to sort of be okay with, I don't know everything. I think that like some of my biggest pieces of advice with respect to sort of like what to focus on, or like what to understand at a very sort of foundational level, is just understanding like the foundational technologies. So like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and like how that gets to the browser, and like understanding those concepts, I think is really, really important. And it's important to, we have all these shiny baubles in the form of like libraries and abstractions and a lot of things that a lot of people like lose focus because like, oh, these are new and shiny and fun or whatever. At the end of the day, it's HTML, it's CSS, and just JavaScript. And the more you understand the sort of fundamental mechanics and the sort of like understanding the characteristics of these languages, what they do, what they accomplish, and like all of that, everything else is like an abstraction that just sort of makes writing that stuff hopefully easier. And those things are going to come and go, right? Once upon a time is jQuery and like MooTools and like all of this other stuff is, you know, these templating languages. And now we're over here and we're like working in React, but then, oh, just kidding. No, now Vue is the hot thing. And now we're all moving here. It's exhausting to sort of operate at that level. So it's like, bring it down, understand the core technologies, but then I'd also say like understand like the sort of core principles like behind those technologies, and that will make like the sort of tool choices and sort of working with them like easier for you. But then it's also one thing that I think it's important to stress is there's 100,000 things that you can do and 100,000 paths you can take. Ask yourself always, like every single day, it's like, is this what I want to be doing? I think very often, especially as junior people, you get chucked into the deep end and you have to swim, and that's good. And you end up doing a lot of stuff that you need to do because that's what's being asked of you. But like, there's a bunch of things, you know, if you're like, ooh, here's this like SVG thing over here. I'm finding that I really like performance optimization, or, ooh, I really like, you know, this thing. Listen to that and find opportunities to sort of like explore that stuff more. I think that like a lot, it is really, it's a potential threat to like find yourself veering off track and doing a bunch of things that you don't necessarily like to do, but you end up being good at them just because it's being asked of you. So not to say don't do the things that you're being asked, but just really sort of be asking yourself, is like, is this, what do I want to be doing, more of this stuff or less of this stuff? And as a junior person, it's good to like be exposed to all parts of the process, and that helps you sort of suss out like, okay, I did that. I did that back end work, but ooh, that was weird, and I don't know if I exactly enjoyed that. Maybe next project I'd like to just sort of focus on this stuff here. So there's that. With respect to sort of like keeping up to date with everything, Twitter's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's like the industry shares so many great examples and is having really good, you know, has good discussions and sort of shares links and all of that good stuff. Really, really nice. But on the other hand, you know, it's just polluted with, you know, politics and like the rest of it. It's like, it's really, really difficult to, you know, sort of separate the wheat from the chaff there. So I'm still very much a fan of things like RSS, so like subscribing to sites, and as they publish things, CSS Tricks and Smashing Magazine and like people's personal blogs and stuff like that are really, really handy. One thing I really, really like is email newsletters. I think gives like a good pulse check of like, here's what's happening, but it's like sort of, you could skim them. So it's like, you know, very rarely will I like consume, you know, even half of like a newsletter. One that I really like, especially like, is one called sidebar.io. and sidebar IO basically rounds up 5 links every day. And some of them are design related, some of them are like tech, more like sort of web development related. Some of them like even sort of get into just sort of like architecture or like whatever, but it's like largely around web design for the most part. And that for me is like this really succinct way. I get it in my inbox, scan the titles. I might read one of the articles, but it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, you're just sort of seeing what the industry is talking about and sort of focusing on, and not that you're going to become an expert in all of that stuff, but it is like helpful to just sort of get like keep your finger on the pulse. So newsletters and RSS, I feel like are sane ways, and Twitter is again a double-edged sword there. And then with respect to sort of layout and stuff like that, so CSS Grid is here. CSS Grid is great. Flexbox has been here even longer, really great. There are increasingly some really great developer tools for manipulating grid and all of that good stuff. There's a couple things that are, one is going to happen, and then another one is more of a wish list thing. Subgrid is presently in Firefox, but it isn't implemented across the board in the other browsers. So this is a fundamental issue between design and development. Design meaning designers working in static design tools like Sketch or Figma. They'll have like the nice 12-column grid with the pink lines and the gaps in between and stuff, and then they just sort of like have everything sort of positioned along these grid lines. And it's like, okay, great, we have CSS Grid now, so now we can do that. But the answer actually is, well, actually we can't do that. We can't just sort of display like a master grid and then sort of snap everything to that master grid. With subgrid, you can. So that's the big thing here. So it's like you can actually sort of declare like a page level grid and then have your like sort of card guts kind of like snapped to, span like 3 columns of that grid. So that's one that I feel like over the course of the next like year or 2 or 3 or whatever is like going to, one, be more fully supported, but 2, what it's doing is bringing the sort of paradigms together of how designers are used to thinking about layout in with sort of how it actually happens in the browser. Because right now it's just it's not how it works in these static design tools, and that's like a big thing that is hard, and it's like it needs to be a sort of like an educational thing that developers have to go, okay, designers, we're actually going to sit down and I'm going to like show you how this like actually works in the browser, because like what you've comped up isn't, especially with things like source order and stuff like that. It's like it's fundamentally different.
Sorry.
Yeah, what were you saying, Justin? Sorry.
There's actually a question that's quite related to that, if you don't mind. So this, what you see in your static design tool versus how you then render it in the browser. And there's a question that was asked around, in a design system, how should we be controlling, positioning and sizing? Should it be on a kind of parent level container element, or should we be doing that on a child element? What do you think is the most ideal way to handle that? Given that we want reusable components and all those kinds of things.
Okay. The answer is sort of both. If you're talking about sort of like box model, like margin, pushing things out and controlling space around a component, increasingly like the components themselves that like live inside of a grid don't control spacing. It's like you sort of handle that at a separate level. So to use an example, if you have like an e-commerce site and you have like your grid of products and it's like a 4 across kind of like grid of, t-shirts or whatever, what's controlling the space in between each product card is a like layout component, and that uses CSS Grid and has this sort of gap property. So you basically say like, I want my gap in between my grid items to be 1 rem big. And that way the product cards don't have to worry about their own sort of spacing. Now, it's not that simple, because obviously the product card itself has its own sort of spacing system going on with it. And so you have like padding sort of pushing in, right? Like pushing the title and the price and the description, or like the add to cart button or whatever, pushing that away from, say, the border or the box shadow or whatever that's being applied to it. So how we tend to do that is we'll define a spacing system and sort of like declare that as a bit of a SAS partial, essentially, or it's just sort of a mix-in we call size. And so then you'll see, like, in our layout component, it'll be like grid gap size 2. And then like inside of our card, it'll be like padding size 2 or whatever. And then so that's like, it's using the same sort of construct, so that if we changed our away from, say, like an 8-point grid or something and wanted to like kick that up to a 12-point grid, everything would sort of like react accordingly to that. So you have like sort of, I think sort of the main takeaway here is like there are layout patterns, and layout patterns should be treated as like sort of their own components, and you sort of put other components inside of those layout sort of patterns, and that sort of gives you a lot of sort of flexibility with respect to like sort of what you put inside of other things and stuff. So
great, thanks.
Yep.
Scott, do you want to get to questions from the chat?
Yeah, so I think I saw an interesting one. One of the first ones posted was, you mentioned that you did some work for your wife's business. And I think someone asked, like, what are the differences? And just to backtrack, and you mentioned that you kind of used the design systems approach for your wife's business's site as well. And someone asked, how different is your approach when it comes to the design systems, depending on how big the site is? You previously mentioned United Airlines, which I assume kind of has definitely either close to or more than 100 different pages that you could possibly be on. How does your approach differ between the example you mentioned of your wife's site and for example, something of that size?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this gets back to, I think, the first question, Deal, that you asked, which is, it's like how you go about doing the work, whether you're doing a 4-page site or 4,000-page site or for, you know, massive organization or whatever. Like, the actual mechanics of like building the parts of the whole doesn't really change all that much. Again, in what Xander, you were sort of asking, it's like there's a button, and the buttons are going to have icons before them, after them. They're going to have big buttons, small buttons. So it's like whether you're doing it for like the biggest companies on earth, or if you're doing it for like, you know, a restaurant website or whatever, it's like you got the same mechanics going on. So like that doesn't really change all that much. What does change is like how robust those things need to be, like how, you know, how feature complete the API needs to be. So for instance, it's like for a 4-page website, maybe you don't have like a large button size, or maybe you don't have like, you just like don't have a need for that. So you just don't define that. So they can't be simple, but it's simpler compared to like, oh, this needs to sort of travel to all these different places and serve all of these use cases. So it's like the complexity of the component will change based on like what you're actually making, but the general spirit of like, we're creating this component, we're creating it for use, so that the next time I need a product card, I already have it. I don't have to rebuild that from scratch, right? So that stays consistent throughout. The other thing that changes, not just like the component complexity and the obviously like the sort of just component number, right? So it's like for something like United Airlines or an equally large organization that I work with, you know, we'll end up with, you know, 80 to 120 components, right? Which again, for a 4-page website, you don't need. You'll have, you know, a dozen or two, right? maybe components, and that gives you everything you need to build that site. But again, build with components. It's the other thing that does change is the amount of documentation and organization and sort of communication strategy around the thing. If you're working on a startup and you're the same person building the components and implementing the components, then it's like you might not actually need, this comprehensive suite of documentation like you would see on material.io or lightningdesignsystem.com or like any of these sort of like popular design systems. It's like those giant like reference websites with like all of this sort of like really like spelled out documentation are like that. They have that documentation because all these different people across different continents and stuff are all sort of using this product. So it's like, as the thing grows and as you, the less you could actually get people in a room together to sort of hash through the problems, the more need for documentation around a design system that grows, right, with the sort of size and the scope. But the general concepts are really honestly the same. It's like you're just building reusable things. As you hit a new use case, you add a new thing to the, throw it on the pile, whether it's like, okay, we need this card to be dismissible. All right, well, now I'm just going to add that option in there. Oh, I need my big button now. Okay, well, then I'm going to add that in there. It's just a matter of like how many times you have to do that, add new components and add new features to existing components.
Okay, so we're about an hour in now. Obviously, I want to be respectful of Brad's time. So,
yeah, I gotta jump in like 10 minutes or so.
Cool. So let's maybe leave room for one more question, if you're keen, Brad.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. Is there anyone that wants to fire something? Okay, I can maybe. Oh.
James says me.
Do you want to do it in text, James, or do you want to do it?
Hey, how's it? Hi.
Hey.
Okay, cool. So basically, I work for an agency, and we working with the designer. She likes to, like, for example, she'll often give me these sort of dribble shots, and it's like these really crazy cool animations, and it's stunning work. But that's, in terms of like creating a design system, most design systems, it's like the IBM, carbon design system or material design. Do you have any sort of direction or resources that you could recommend of how to do those types of like out there sites like the fwa.com or awards.com type of sites, but do it in a way that makes sense in production and is actually not just completely, something that is manageable essentially. And also, if you have time, what is your opinion on those type of sites? Do you like doing those type of sites? What is your opinion there?
Wait, what was that second part? Sorry.
So I was just wondering if you have a particular opinion on those types of websites, like those really like out there sort of sites.
Oh yeah, yeah.
What is your perspective on those?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they're amazingly creative and stuff, and I think that there's absolutely a time and a place for them. I do think that it's sometimes I know the Mac Pro website for a while ago. It's a delicate balance between like, wow, we're like here to like knock your socks off, but then also like if the thing's like totally unusable and it weighs 30 megs, then it's like that's sort of it's a matter of balancing sort of like visual and aesthetic and experiential sort of robustness with respect, user respect, and like best practices, and and it is possible to find that sweet spot. So I just say that's my opinion on it. Is it's like it's not like we shouldn't ever be doing these, and we should all just have these like boring ass like enterprise level sort of design systems and just use Bootstrap for everything or something like that. Like, no, we absolutely need that sort of creativity and to push the boundaries. And I've worked on, projects that do that, but in a systems minded way. And I think that there's sort of a trick to these types of sites that I'll share. And one is to sort of recognize that there's a time and a place for reusable patterns and that it's actually, you can carve out places for things to be a little bit more wide open than others. So for instance, a hero area or something like that, it's like your design system your hero could just be like a box and it's just like, go freaking nuts. But like whenever you hit the sign up screen and you see the the text fields and like the password and stuff like that, those things are more like meat and potatoes patterns. So it's like you sort of want to like establish some conventions for those. You want to have like a little bit more rigidity around maybe those patterns compared to the more sort of like marketing or like sort of things that you're just like, I need this stuff to be all over the place. But you could create even like a card component to be like, the most like razzle dazzle thing with like these like gorgeous, like SVG sort of like things like bleeding off. And it's like, you bundle that up as a component. I think that there's a misconception with design systems that like, because it is coming from IBM and Google and Salesforce and all these like sort of big old enterprises, that it's like design systems equal boring ass whatever. And that just isn't true. It can be as aesthetically just knock your socks off as it needs to be. And I've worked on those things, like working with like Condé Nast, like the big publisher. And it's like, they have like all these different publications, Vanity Fair, Vogue, like really high impact, high, like, aesthetic, sort of stuff. There's like a sophistication to it and stuff. Like, it's not boring work aesthetically by any means. It's just what you're doing is, again, just this notion of like, okay, we're gonna build for reuse. Like if we're building these patterns, let's like actually have them be patterns that we could use throughout. So carve out spaces where you're like, okay, this stuff is just like wide open, do whatever you want. Like your hero component, it's just like, go to town. Like we're not like inflicting like, okay, the title must be here and the description must be here and there's a CTA and there's like a safe space for a background image or whatever. It's like, no, maybe that's too rigid or like locked down. Maybe that's helpful, or maybe that's like one flavor of a hero that you can establish and then reuse. But like you could also say, because of the nature of our work, we want to sort of have something that's like a more expressive or like more sort of bespoke. But then whenever you get maybe below the fold or something like that, maybe there's some more like meat and potatoes kind of components that you actually do want to sort of bundle up and sort of and have be a little bit more rigid. So hopefully that answers that question a little bit. But like, one thing I do just want to reinforce though is like, design systems does not equal aesthetically boring or like just stale, like roll your eyes, just conformist cookie cutter stuff. Like it really doesn't. It can be as wild and crazy as you need it to be. And it's like CSS Zen Garden. Like if you're familiar with that, it's like, here's the same structure, the same structural foundation, and you can like layer the aesthetic layer is the most malleable layer of the stack. And that's like really, really fun because it's just like, cool, I can have my button that has all of my best practices in there and stuff like that. And then I can just sort of like layer on whatever I want that button to look like on top of it, which is really neat. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. That was a lot of fun. Thank you for your questions.
Thanks for your time, Brad. I was a bit scared that we're not going to have a lot of interest, and I actually think we ended up having a bit too much interest. I think we didn't even get a third of the way through in terms of questions. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's room for a part 2 in the future at some point.
Yeah. And if you're ever sort of like going through stuff, I'm happy to answer questions over email or anything like that too. I'm not like trying to sign myself up to a bunch of work, but like if you're ever like, hey, I like tried to do that thing you said, and I'm, you know, I'm getting this pushback. I like helping get people unstuck. So
Okay.
happy to do that.
Great stuff. So it's maybe also worthwhile just saying, for those that don't know, Brad has a book called Atomic Design that you can also check out online. I don't know if there's anything else you maybe want to plug on your side, Brad.
Yeah, if you can read my book online for free. If you buy the book right now, I'm donating 100% of all the proceeds from the book to helping keep people fed during all of this. So it's all going to sort of food banks, which unfortunately, a lot of places are really sort of struggling with that. So so that'll be the thing I plug. But yeah, you know, Brad _Frost on Twitter, or you know, my website's bradfrost.com, and I blog there about this kind of stuff. Try to pretty regularly or whatever, but my contact information's there too, if again you feel like reaching out. All right, all. Well, thank you so much. Stay healthy, stay safe in all of this. And I will also say, and I should have probably said this in my intro, but South Africa is one of my favorite places on earth, and I really love your country, and you know, I hope that you're weathering this okay, and we all sort of come out the other end of this okay. So. But yeah, until we can see each other and hang out and have a drink together, we'll do this. But yeah, thanks everybody. Take care.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Bye.